Hi, I'm Brad Peebler, and in this tape we're going to be doing several projects utilizing particle effects and HyperVoxels extensively. It's going to be a lot of fun. You saw some of the clips before the tape here, at the beginning of the tape. Now keep in mind we're going to recreate those scenes, so what we create here may be slightly different than what you saw in the final output on the beginning of the tape. However, the content that you can download from desktopimages.com or that you have on your DVD-ROM has both the scenes that we're creating here as well as the scenes that were used for the opening of the tape. They'll only be slightly different, but at least that way you have both versions. All right, well, let's get started with our first project. In this project, we're going to create an exhaust effect. We're going to use particle effects to create the particle emission, and then we're going to use HyperVoxels volume mode to create a really nice, dense, thick smoke coming off the back. Something like you might see off of the back of a rocket or even off of an asteroid flying through the atmosphere. Let's get started. First of all, we need to load the scene. We go to File, Load Scene. In our setup directory here, we have the HV3 Trail A setup. This is the basic setup with a nice motion path for us. You can see here our null object whipping around. And what we're going to do is attach some particles to that and then attach HyperVoxels onto that. So here we go. Let's get started. We'll go to our Scene tab and we go to the FX browser and we'll simply add an HV emitter. You can see it right there. All right, we'll go ahead and open the Properties tab and just slide this over for a second. Close that up there. What we need to do is parent this to the null object. There are many ways to do that. I'm going to do it in the schematic view. Just change it to schematic view here. We can see here's our HV emitter. Here's the object that has the motion path. We'll choose the emitter, hold the control key, click on the trailer, and now it's been parented. So go back in here and you can see already we have our particles spewing about. All right, so the first change I can see that needs to be made is the particles are taking on too much motion from the parent item. So to fix that, we'll go to our Etc. tab here, and you see there's an option for parent motion. So we're going to just drag this down here, and we can do it interactively. Let's just see. That's still pretty strong for rocket exhaust. It should just pretty much leave the exhaust behind it. Still a little too strong. We'll just dial that all the way down, like 1 or 2%. So it has still a little bit of motion. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, the next thing we need to do is change the scale and the number of particles that are being emitted. So go to the Generator tab here, and let's just crank up our birth rate to, say, 300 particles per second. Now we've got a pretty good looking stream there. And it's a little bit too thick. We want a thinner particle emission, so we're going to turn this down on the particle size. Let's just dial this down. Let's try ½ meter. See how that looks? It's still a little bit too big. So we'll go 0.2 by 0.2 by 0.2. That's pretty darn good. And let's crank up our particle limit just to make sure we don't run out of particles at any point. So let's turn this back up to 1500 there. Okay, now we've got a pretty nice looking particle trail following behind our object there, creating a nice little swath through the space. So the next thing we want to do is randomize the particles a little bit. So we'll go to our Motion tab here. And under Explosion, we'll turn that up to about 1. See how that looks. That's a little bit too much. You can see how it's causing the particles to spread out. So that's what we want, but we want it to be a little bit more subtle. Just sort of slowly expanding after they emit. Okay, that's very nice. 0.1 there. Gives just enough to change it from that general shape, but not so much that it's really expanding widely. We'll actually use HyperVoxels to create some of the expansion effect as well. And we'll give ourselves a little bit of vibration. Let's see here. You see that gives it just a slight change. You can see the particles kind of emitting and then vibrating around a little bit. We'll turn that down just a little bit here. There we go. Now we've got a nice particle trail going there. Looks pretty tight. Let's go over to our Particle tab here, and let's adjust some of these values. Let's go ahead and turn up the particle weight so the particles get a little heavier. You see that gives them a little bit more momentum, so we need to turn up the resistance a little bit. Turn it down rather so they kind of fly through space a little more. There we go. Now you can see the particles really moving. You can see the vibration affecting them. Getting a nice effect there, especially as they go by here at the beginning. You see the dissipation caused by that slight amount of explosion and a little bit of vibration at the same time. Of course, adding some weight to the particles with a little bit less resistance helps as well. Let's go ahead and change one more parameter here. That's the lifetime of the particles. I want the particles to be only living for about 30 frames, so we get a shorter particle trail. There you can see, you get a shorter trail there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to randomize that by adding plus or minus 15. So some of the particles will last as long as 45 frames, and others will die as quickly as 15 frames. That sort of thins it out, but also gives us a nice randomization on where the particles exist. All right, so that's it for setting up the particles. Pretty straightforward on this example. Later we'll get into some more advanced particle setup. Right now, before we add the HyperVoxels, I want to add another light to the scene so that at the head of the particle trail we have a nice glowing light, especially when it flies by the walls. We want it to illuminate those areas. And it'll also help us by illuminating the HyperVoxels right at the tip there. So we'll switch back here into layout. We'll go ahead and close our particle effects emitter since we're done with that. Go over to Items, Add Light, Point Light, and we'll call this Trail Light. Okay, and we want that to be at the tip, so we know we want to parent it. So we want to parent this guy to the trailhead. So once again, we go to our schematic view, and we choose the trail light, hold down Control, click on the trailer. Go back to camera view, and now we can see that that light has been attached. Okay, I chose a point light so that I get sort of an array of light going off in all directions. I'm going to open the light's properties here, and we're going to change a few things. First of all, I'm going to crank up the light intensity to about 150% so we get a really bright light. Let's go ahead and turn on our texture shaded view here, and let's go to our display options here, hitting D, and I'll tell it max OpenGL lights up to 8. Okay, now we can see the effect of that light in there, and if we move it around, you can see how that's illuminating the room as it flies around. Pretty cool. What we want to do, however, is we want to give it a little bit of fall off, so it's not always illuminating the entire room. We only want it to illuminate areas that it gets next to. So I'm going to change my camera view to a top view here, and I can see the light here. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. And we'll go ahead and adjust the intensity fall off. We'll set this to the inverse square, and then we'll start to drag the intensity fall off. You can't really see it. Let me go back to wireframe here. It's a little hard to see on your monitor, so we'll turn it here. There we can see this little circle around here shows us the nominal distance for this light, where it's going to have its most effect. So we're just going to set that to about 1.5 meters, like this. So now when it gets closer to the walls, that's when it's going to hit. Let's just go ahead and center on the light there. So you can see as it gets close to the walls, it'll illuminate in those areas. So this will be the really bright spot, then it'll fall off from there. So that should work pretty nicely. In fact, let's just do a quick test render of the room. There we go. You can see how the light's hitting the walls here, here, and here, giving us that nice subtle illumination. That way as it flies around, it'll give us key highlights off of those walls. Okay, so we're done with the particles and the lighting. Now what we need to do is set up the HyperVoxels. So this is the fun part of the project. We'll go over here to our Scene tab, open up Volumetrics, double-click on HyperVoxels. We've already added that for you in the HyperVoxel setup scene. Now what we need to do is open Viper, and we'll double-click on the HV emitter. And you can see here, we can now see the particle effect as it's being skinned with HyperVoxel surface mode. Let's go ahead and make a preview of that so we can see how the particles look in surface mode. Okay, you can see they're coming by pretty large. Most of our lighting is happening up from above. Now in this case, we don't really care about the lighting so much since HyperVoxel's volume mode is going to illuminate itself mostly from having luminosity set on the surfaces. Alright, so we can see the preview here, the surface mode of HyperVoxels flying around. Looks pretty cool. Kind of reminds me of the abyss tendril, water tendril. You can see the particles sort of popping on and popping off. That's fine for now. We'll do a nice smooth fade in and fade out once we get to volume mode. But we want to just show how you can use the surface mode here to get a quick test of the motion and the scale of the particles. So that's looking pretty good. I do want to change the particle size just a little bit, I think. So let's go ahead and pause this here and go to a middle frame. I'm going to hit the Tab key to hide the windows so I can quickly get to a middle frame here. Like right about there is probably a good one. Tab key again, and we can render that and see how the particles look. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and dial down the particles a little bit, scale them down. That's a little bit too small, right about there. So you can see I just dialed that up with the mini slider. We're at about 304.7597 millimeters. I usually like to just round that off numerically. Once I've got it, once I quick hit it here with the mini slider, then I'll often just type that in to make my numbers even. It doesn't matter, it's just a housekeeping thing that I like to do. All right, now the next thing we want to do is go ahead and change this into volume mode. And you can see now our HyperVoxels. Nice little smoky HyperVoxels effect here. I can't see them too clearly yet because they're not very well illuminated. Let's go to our shading tab here and go to Advanced. And let's go ahead and tell it to use both the room light, there we go, and the trail light. So that gives us a little bit brighter tip. And now we can see these guys much better. Now we have a nice smoky effect here. Pretty cool effect already without even changing any settings. It's one of the great things about HyperVoxels. If you get the particles right, HyperVoxels will actually look pretty good just right out of the gates. All right, let's go back to I think our geometry is all set up here. Let's go to our shading tab now. Go back to Basic. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the color of the smoke based on the particle's age. What we want to do now is I'm going to be changing the color based on a gradient. One of the things about HyperVoxels is that when you first put the colors on, it may not look quite right. I'm going to be using like some yellows and browns. It's going to look odd, but the reason I'm going to use those colors is that I'm going to boost that by using luminosity. And when I boost that, it's going to bring those colors up more into oranges and yellows. So keep in mind, sometimes you have to sort of think ahead of what you're doing at the moment to understand what the final end result is going to be once you apply things like luminosity and some opacity. So let's go ahead and jump back in here. So we'll go over to our color texture option here, and we'll open that up. And once we've got that open, we'll change it to a gradient. And we're going to base the gradient on the particle's age. This way, as a particle is emitted, it'll start with one color and then fade off to different colors as the particle trail gets older. So we're going to start off with this first particle here. It's going to make it sort of a kind of greenish blue. It can be pretty subtle. I just make a little bit of change. Again, this way it's going to blow out to white, but it gives a good starting point here. So we can turn up the green a little bit more. And then I'm going to create another keyframe right here about 2 frames in. So it's not very far apart, but it does give us some nice control from the tip. Keeping in mind that the colors on a plume of smoke, especially coming right out of the back of a rocket or off of an asteroid, it's going to be very hot right at the front, and then it's quickly going to cool down and go through a few different color bands on the way. So we have to add several color steps right there at the beginning. It may seem a little strange to have color steps at 0 and 2 and 4 frames, but it'll make a big difference in the final renders. All right, so our second keyframe here is going to be more of a beige. Again, I can just click on these numbers directly, or I can just open up the color swatch. So we'll go ahead and choose a color of a brownish in here, kind of bring some of that red out, and then get it to more of a beige color like this again, down a little bit more gray. That's pretty good. And then we'll go to the next keyframe, which we're going to set at about 3.5. And this one's going to be a little bit darker. So just bring that down to more of a tan. And then another keyframe a little later is going to be even darker. And I'm right-clicking on this color swatch here to bring the color up or down. So once you've got the color that you like, you can make it brighter or darker just by right-clicking and dragging. And then finally another key down here, around 28 or 30, and this one's going to be almost black. It's going to be pretty much like charcoal. In fact, I want to even this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my color swatch, set it all the way down to black to flatten the numbers, and then just right-click and bring these up. That makes sure that all 3 numbers are identical now, as opposed to being tilted towards brown. There we go. So you can see, again, as I said, it's a little strange right now, but you do see the nice black area back here, the nice white tip on the end where it's going to be hot, and then towards the brown, and then flying back here into the black area. Now it's getting a little bit hard to see these darker areas because we don't have any backdrop. What we're going to do is we're going to make a quick render of the background environment so we can get that into the Z buffer. So we'll go ahead and say use texture here, disable HyperVoxels so that we can quickly make a render of the frame. And once it's done a pass of the render, we're all set. We hit render here, and now we add HyperVoxels. There we can see it stands out a lot better over that background than it did just over black. Alright, so as I mentioned, the next step is to add some luminosity. That's going to help us blow some of these colors out. So we're going to go over here to our luminosity settings, and we're going to start by driving this down a little bit actually, because we're going to drive it back up using a gradient. So we come in here to the texture, go to gradient, and setting it at 50% gave us some darks back here so we can see where that was at. That gives us a good idea of how dark we want it to get. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off, it's going to be again based on particle age, like this, and we're going to go from 0 to 30. Alright, so frame 0 of a particle's life, it's this amount of luminosity, and frame 30, it'll be this bright on luminosity. So we want to set frame 0 at 50%, just like we had outside, and then we'll set frame 30 at about 5%. You can see by driving the luminosity down, I've actually lowered the overall intensity of the effect. What I'm going to do now is bring opacity down, which will allow us to go further into the volume, which will bring up the brightness and sort of the heat inside that rocket flame. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Go ahead and use texture on the luminosity. And now on the opacity here, we're just going to go into the texture. We're going to tell it gradient map. Once again, we're going on particle age. Same basic setup from 0 to 30. So create another keyframe down here. Now at frame 0, we want the value to be 40%. And you see now it got a lot hotter right here. And then at frame 30, we want it to be about 80%. Okay, so now we've got some of that brightness back in there. The next step is to adjust our thickness and smoothness. So let's just start adjusting the thickness here. And you can see as I bring this up, again, I'm going to go ahead and change to an earlier frame. So what we can do is I'm going to go under preview options here and set this to particle preview. And you can see now I can see the particle as it would be 88 frames old. So I'm going to drive this down to an early frame. And you can see now it's going to be really hot at the very beginning. A few frames later, we'll render that. And you see frame 15. So this is a good, quick way, without having to render the entire effect, to go in and get some quick tests to see how the individual particles will look through their particle range, through their age range. Okay, so we're going to change our thickness to about 35. That's pretty good. That's about where I want the thickness. Now I'm going to adjust the smoothness. This is going to, again, make it a little bit thicker on the outside here, a little bit less smooth by driving that down a little further, like this, you can see. So it doesn't allow us to penetrate as far. So let's bring that back up. It should make it a little brighter. We drive it up to about 80, let's go down a little bit, 75%. Okay, so now we're getting back to a brighter effect. Let's go back to our scene preview. First of all, let's go to a later frame here again. And go to our scene preview there. And now we can see it's nice and bright across there, and then falling off into this area here. Okay, now we have the basic setup for the surfacing of our volume type volumetric here. The next thing I want to do is add a dissolve envelope based on the particle's age, so that the particles aren't opaque all the way back along the trail. We want them to start off opaque and then fade off as they get older. So we'll come back to HyperVoxels here, and we're going to choose our dissolve right at the top, and we go to dissolve texture, and again we'll use a gradient. Once again, that gradient is going to be based on particle age from 0 to 30 frames, and we'll set that to go from 0 value, so no dissolve, up to 100% dissolve. Now you can see here, you get the hot tip here, then it comes back around, and you get the nice dissolved out trail on the backside. Okay, we'll go ahead and say use texture. And finally, what we want to do is tweak with the hypertexture a little bit. So we're going to go over to our hypertexture. And right now we're using crumple. I really like FBM for this type of effect. Crumple and FBM are both pretty good, but I'm going to go ahead and switch that to FBM. It's going to give us a little bit more texture, especially where it starts to dissolve out here on the back. Let's go ahead and zoom to an earlier frame. Let me hit the tab key here. Let's get it where it's a little closer to us. Maybe back this way. There we go. Okay, now you can see this really nice smoky effect here, falling back in and then fading out towards the back. All right, we'll go ahead and add another frequency here to the effect. That's going to increase the amount of detail. And then I'm going to change the amplitude of the effect so that it doesn't start off quite so affected here. And then what we'll do is we'll start off with less texture amplitude here and then fade into more and more texture amplitude as we go back to the back. So let's go ahead and turn this up a little bit first. See how that looks? Pretty good. And now we'll go into the texture here, and we'll tell it we want to use a gradient, again based on particle age. And we're going to go from 0 to 40 frames just to make sure we're completely covered in there. And here at the beginning you can see the texture is way too strong. It's really breaking it up. So we'll go back to the first keyframe and we'll set that down to 40%. And that gives a nice and thick amount here. Less texture effect, so that smooths that out a little bit. Let's try even a little bit lower, like about 30%. There you go. Now you can see you get the nice effect here. And then as we go back, the texture amplitude gets stronger and stronger and stronger, which really starts to fade it out towards the back. So we'll say use texture. And I also want to add a texture effect of turbulence. All right. The turbulence effect is going to basically push the texture through the volume towards the camera. So no matter the aspect of the particles, it will always be pushing that texture towards the camera. It gives a really nice sort of smoldering effect for the smoke. All right. Once we've got that set up, I also want to change the effect speed. I want to slow it down just a little bit so it's a little bit slower. I usually go between 50 and 100%. 60 is pretty good. So there it is. Pretty simple to set up. We did some nice particle work there. Also some good HyperVoxels work using HyperVoxels volumes. Let's go ahead and take a look at the final rendered animation. All right, you can see the particles blowing by here very quickly. Notice the really nice, thick, almost pyroclastic looking smoke effect you get coming out of behind that effector there. And of course, as it flies by the camera, you can see the older particles really dissipate nicely as they go from that dark black and sort of fade out using the texture effect of turbulence and the dissolve envelope. So pretty nice effect there, set up very, very quickly. All right, in this project, we're going to create a meteor shower. Again, we're going to be using particle effects with a parent emitter to create the streams of meteors falling to the ground. And we're going to use HyperVoxels to add on the smoke and fire attached to the meteors. All right, let's get to it. First of all, we need to load our scene. So once again, we go to Load Scene into the Setup directory. And you'll see the HV3 Meteor Storm Setup scene. We load that up. That just gives us our room, basically. We've got a couple lights already set up here. And these are going to be, this dedicated light here is what we're going to use for illuminating the HyperVoxels. Basically, we've set up two different lights. One light illuminating the room, and a second one that focuses only on the HyperVoxels. The second light, the dedicated light, we've deactivated Effect Diffuse and Effect Specular. That way, it's only going to be used to impact the HyperVoxel setting. Just gives us a little bit more control so we can illuminate the room with one set of lights and the HyperVoxels effect with a second one. All right, here we go. First of all, we need to add our particles. So we'll come over here to our items, and instead of using the FX browser, I'm going to show you another way to add HyperVoxels particles, which is to come over to your Add pop-up here, Particle Effects, Add Particle Emitter, and we'll call it Comets. Say OK. And that added a comet emitter, added an emitter named Comet, and it's opened up the Properties panel for us. So it's a nice quick shortcut there. We're not done yet, though. We need to add one more. Add Particle Effects, Emitter, and we'll call this Comet Trails. And say OK. And you can see it's opened up those properties. And finally, we're going to add a collision item. And we'll just call that collision. That's fine. And there it is. Now, the collision plane, we want to represent the ground. You can see right now it comes in as a sphere. You can see the type is set to sphere, and you can see the boundary area here is spherical. So we'll go in here and we'll tell it we want that to be a planar collision plane. And if we go to our perspective view, we can see a little problem that just occurred. If we go here, you can see the planar collision plane is actually floating about 1 meter off the ground. That's because when we had it set to sphere, it had a 1 meter radius. When we set it down here to plane, it still has a 1 meter radius, you can see here, which means it's raised up. We'll just simply set that to 0. You could also move the collision plane down 1 meter if you wanted to, but either way is fine. This is basically going to give us an infinite plane that the particles can bounce across when they drop onto the floor. Let's go back to our camera view here, and now we'll start to work with the particles. Let's go to our comets, and we can see there they are. I'm going to raise them up a little bit. Let's just raise them up above the camera's perspective. We'll put them right here for now. We'll move them up a little higher in a minute. Let's go to our Scene tab. This way we can open up the particles' properties. We'll open up FX property here. That'll open up the tab or palette for this item. First thing I want to do is spread this out on X and Z. We'll just stretch it out here. Just keep stretching it. Looks like about 5 meters will do. So we'll set that up about 5 meters on the X and 5 meters on Z. This is going to be the plane from which our little meteor shower or comets drop down. We don't really need a variance in height there, so we can dial this down quite a bit, actually. All right, so there they are. And we'll go ahead and move this up out of the camera view so they can drop from there. Now, if we go to our perspective, we zoom back out a little bit, we push play, you can see the particles are emitting, but they're not going anywhere. What we want to do is we want them to come slamming down to the Earth here. So rather than actually giving them a velocity on Y, we're going to use gravity so they accelerate as they approach. All right, so to do that, all we need to do is go into the Etc tab of our HyperVoxels particles properties. So here we are on the Particle Effects Emitter, Etc tab, and we set the gravity. Let's set it to -9.8 meters. And there you can see we now have a nice rainstorm of comets. That's a little bit aggressive. Let's go to our camera view here. That would be a lot of comets. That would be disastrous. So what we're going to do is we're going to dial this down a little bit. We're going to set the birth rate to, like, I don't know, 3. See how that looks. Yeah, that's pretty good. You can dial this up a little bit. Let's see, go up to like 8. Actually, 3 was pretty good. So set that back down there. Now you see you have far fewer particles dropping to the ground. Now they're not dropping very quickly, not like a meteor would. So what we want to do is go to our particle tab here, and let's make them heavier. Let's make them about 2.5 times heavier. Okay, now you can see the particles really dropping down to the ground. Let's try a little higher, a little bit more. That's a little too much. Let's 2 is pretty good. Let's do 2.5. That's good. All right, now what I'll do is when they hit the ground, I want them to scatter a little bit. Right now they're just hitting and sticking. So to do that, I need to go to my collision plane properties. So we'll go to the collision plane object and hit FX properties again, and that brings up that window there. And what we can do is we can go down to increase the roughness, 20% there. And now if we choose the comets, you can see as they hit, they actually bounce around and scatter on the ground. We'll put a little more friction on the ground there, and that'll cause them to settle down eventually. Let's reduce our roughness, about 15% there. And now you can see them scattering on the ground. Maybe a little hard to see. Let's open up the Show Size panel here, and we'll crank that up a little bit. Let's actually turn that up. You can see them there. Now you can see how they're falling down and bouncing around on the ground, kind of ricocheting around, kind of rolling around. Let's actually change the roughness again and crank that up a little bit so they move a little bit more. There we go. So I want to scatter them around quite a bit. So set that up to about 25%, and you can see them all bouncing around there. All right. We can size our size back off there and turn off Show Size. And you've seen that. That's pretty good. Now we need the trails to fall behind the comets, and this particle here is going to act as the trails. What we can do with particle effects is we can parent one emitter to the other. So what we do is we set up a parent-child relationship, and we can have the first emitter creating the initial particles, and the second one will create streams after that. There are 2 things we have to do. First of all, we have to set up the parent-child relationship between the two, and then we have to set the child object up as a parent emitter type. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we do that. And again, we go into our schematic view, and we're going to choose the comet trails, control-click the comets there. Now it's parented. It's just that easy. Let's come back over here, and you'll see, yes, in fact, it is parented. If we go to the particle effects controls, and I'm on the comets controls here, so we'll switch that up to comet trails. Go to generator, and we'll go over to nozzle and set that to parent emitter. And now you can see as they drop, they collide and they create these little nice effects on the bottom here with the parent. You'll notice I'm running out of particles at the end, so we've got quite a few settings we need to change here to make this all work out just right. First of all, we're going to increase the number of particles, so that's pretty straightforward. We're going to go in here and crank that up to maybe 1,000 or maybe 1,500 or 15,000, little typo there. Next we want to do is we want to increase the number of particles that are being emitted. A couple problems, you'll notice that they slow down to a complete stop, and there are these little chunks here, little bands, like each frame emits a certain number of particles, and then you can see the intra-frame separation there. We're going to fix that a number of ways. First of all, we're going to increase the particles birth rate, so we'll say that to 200 particles per second. That helps a little. Now we're going to go over to the etc. tab here, and we've got the position blur, and we're going to select that and set that up to 500%. That's going to change the position for each frame, and it kind of separates them out. It's really helped the banding. You're still getting some there, but it's helped it quite a bit. Now the other thing we want to do is add a little bit of vibration here. So we're going to go to the Motion tab and choose Vibration, add just a little bit, and that's pretty good. Starting to separate a little bit. We want these guys to be pretty close. We want these nice columns to drop down here, little columns of smoke dropping down. So that's pretty good. Let's go over to our generator here, decrease it down to about 0.1. And I like to set up a smaller particle generator size when I use parent emitters, just to get it out of the way. Looks pretty good. That's a pretty cool effect when they hit the ground there. It's a nice sparking effect. The asteroids colliding on the ground. Another thing I want to do is change the particle life here. And I'm going to change the particles so they last not quite as long. Let's just change this into about 50. And that thins them out a little bit. And I'm going to go to the etc. tab. And I'm going to decrease the parent motion, which is going to make the particles not drop quite so fast from their initial motion. Looks pretty good. You can see them following the parents, but they don't quite follow as much. And they follow better after the scattering because they don't have as much of the initial velocity once it hits. Pretty cool effect there. Let's see what else might we want to change here. Looking pretty good. The generator tab's looking good. I think that's pretty good. I think we can leave it here. Let's go ahead and move on to HyperVoxels. We've got that set up. Let's go ahead and close these two settings. Take a look at our particles. You can see they've got a pretty nice effect already, just as it sits. The next thing we need to do is add in the HyperVoxels. So we'll stop this here, and we'll open up HyperVoxels. Volumetrics, double-click on HyperVoxels. You need to open up Viper. This is where some people might get confused. Do not activate the comets item, just the comet trails. The comet particles are basically just placeholders for the comet trails. The comet trails are what we want to actually apply the HyperVoxels to, and that's what will represent the columns of smoke dropping, and of course the sparks and the HyperVoxels along the ground. Okay, let's double-click on comet trails, and you can see immediately we get what looks like pouring water. It's actually kind of a cool effect. If we wanted to, we could render this out, have a nice little dripping water effect. But that's not what we're looking for. We want to create nice volumetric streaming particles of asteroids or comets dropping to the surface here. The first thing we want to do is change the scale of the particles. So we're just going ahead and drag this up a little bit. Let's go to about 250 millimeters. It's pretty good. This is sort of the maximum thickness that I want the particles to be. What I want to do, though, is I want to thin particles out as they get closer to the ground. First of all, we're going to go to the particle size settings here and change texture. As I mentioned, we're going to use a gradient. So we set that to gradient. We tell it to be based on distance to object, and we'll set it to be based on itself. Okay? When using the distance to object gradient on a particle emitter, the important thing to remember is that it's actually based on the pivot point of the actual object itself. So it's not coming from the center point of the particle, it's actually coming from the pivot or the base of the original emitter. Very important to remember that when we're applying the gradients based on distance to object. It's not coming from each individual emitter, it's coming from the pivot point. Okay, so the value here is going to be 0 meters from the object, from the base up here. If we look at the position of the object, let's go ahead and hit the tab key here, scroll back. If we look at the comet's object, you can see we move that up almost 5 meters. So that means that the child, which is Comet Trails, is also up about 5 meters. So as they drop down the ground, it's going to be a 5-meter trip to get there. So what we want to do is come in here and we'll say, all right, from 0 to 5 meters. So we want to do, and we want them to start off 100% of their original thickness. As we can see here, they are doing very nicely. And then we want it to thin out as it goes down. Let's just take our bottom value here and drive that down. And you can see how you start off nice and thick here, and then they get thinner and thinner until they hit the ground. All right, pretty cool. Now what we want to do is actually go in and let's change the bottom value here to about 50%. And I don't want it to fall off evenly like that. I want it to start off and stay thick until it gets down pretty far down before it hits the ground there, just to thin out just towards the end. So I'll create another key here, and we'll change that value. You can see it's about 88%. Let's take it to 90, and then let's pull that value down, which means it's going to stay at 100%, then fade to 90%, and then down to that 40% down here. That's pretty good. Let's just drag it a little bit further down. Right about there. And of course you can tweak with these things all day long. But that looks pretty good. So you can see the particles come in pretty thick, and then they stream down to smaller particles just before they hit the ground. Alright, the next thing we need to do is start working with the color. And before we do that, let's go ahead and turn it into volume mode. And there we can see our nice little smoke plumes. Looks pretty cool so far. Again, it's not exactly what we want. We want sort of burning atmosphere smoke. So we need it to go from a sort of hot white to a yellowish brown, and then again to a darker smoke up here at the top. So to do that, we'll just go to shading here. And we'll go into our basic tab, color, texture. Alright, and once again, our good friend the gradients. If you haven't got the picture by now, with HyperVoxels, we use a lot of gradients. They're very, very useful. Okay, so again, we're going to start off here with a nice hot white at the tip. Let's go ahead and go back a little ways in time here so we can see, there we go, now we can see some beginnings of the particles as they're coming down. So we'll say, all right, let's start off here with a nice white, and then we're going to go ahead and add in sort of a yellowish color. Again, I need to change my input parameter. Right now I'm set to previous layer. Let's turn that off. Set this to particle age. There we go. And the particle age that we want to go with, it's going to be like, say about 90 frames, 95 frames maybe. Okay, so we'll create a keyframe there. So this is the color timing that we're going to go through from 0 to 95 frames. Starting off white, and then at about frame 2 or 3, we're going to go to a more yellowish beige. Again, I'll just come in here and choose these guys like this. A little bit lighter. That's pretty good. And then we'll create another keyframe there at around 7 or 8. And this one's going to get a little bit more orange. And we'll mix a little bit of brown into that as well at the same time. Darken that down a little bit. There we go. Alright. You see again the gradient in here. You can see the nice color swatch as it goes along. Then we're going to add in one a little further down. And this one's going to be full on brown. And then eventually it's going to get to a dark brown and even charcoal. So we'll right click and drag this down, choose this one, right click and drag it down. Okay, so that's the basis. You can see here the full life of the particle where it goes from that white tip. And you'll notice it looks a little strange. This particle stream seems to be a lot more spread out than this one. That's because what you're seeing are particles that are traveling very fast. All right, so all those particles have just been emitted, but because it's dropping so quickly, they're all very new, but they're spread out. The particles down below are particles that have been living for a long time. The ones we saw on the right, the long brown column that we saw, those have all been just kind of floating there in space, so they've had a chance to turn to their later colors. So the next thing we need to do is start working to brighten these things up to make them look a lot hotter. All right, here we go. So the next thing we want to do then is use texture, and we'll start working on the luminosity. So we'll just go in here to our texture, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up the luminosity using a gradient based on particle age again. So I just come right over here, and we'll say particle age, and we'll go ahead and start it off. We'll go from 0 to, let's say, 100. There we go. Set this back to camera view. All right, so there's our gradient swatch from 0 to 100. Let's start them off at about 200%. Okay, and now you can see I'm starting to really get hot in here. Okay, a much better look for our gradients on the particles. So what we want to do now is create a couple more keyframes. Let's just go ahead and have it start to fade off here pretty quickly. So we'll say, all right, right in there you're going to go to maybe 150. And then down in here, you're going to go to 100. And then down in here, you go to 50. As we get older, we'll stay at about 50. All right, so that means it's going to get really bright. You can see it here again, much brighter here. Still bright at the tip here, but then getting darker and darker and darker as we go. All right, so these are pretty good. Let's just adjust these a little bit. Again, I'll sometimes just quickly lay them down and then come back in afterwards and tweak with those a little bit. Let's just drag this one up a little bit as well. There we go. Just kind of clamping that off. All right, so that's the first bit of luminosity. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to create another bit of luminosity that's based on the distance effectively to the ground plane. The reason we want to do this is when the particles come down and they hit, we want to make sure that when they hit and scatter, they get hot again. Right? So some of those particles that they've gotten pretty old before they hit the ground, we want them to get hotter once more. So what we're going to do is we're going to layer on top of the luminosity another texture. All right? So if you can imagine the column of particles here varying in brightness, well, rather than applying another one based on the age, we're going to put one based on the distance to the object. So I'll apply a second luminosity effect using a gradient, but the gradient is going to have an alpha channel to fade it out the further away we get from the ground. So let's just take a look. All right, once again, I'm going to go ahead and hit Use Texture. I'm going to make a quick test render so we can get the background in there again. And reactivate that. There we go, that helps to see it. And we'll go back into luminosity here. And I'm going to add a second layer. And this is going to be a gradient once more. And you can see immediately it's starting to brighten that up entirely. So what we want to do is we want to go distance to object. In this case, we're going to say distance to the collision plane, which is the ground plane. So it's right at 0, 0, 0. And we'll say the further away we get from it, the more we want it to fade out. So in this case, we'll just set the alpha mat to 0. Now this is a little strange because it seems upside down. Our gradient swatch going from 0 to, in this case, 2 meters, that's actually, in our case, going up. So it's starting at the collision plane and working in both directions, down and up. 2 meters away, there'll be this fade off. We only care about above it. Because the gradient swatch is oriented the way it is, seems like we're only going down away from it, but you have to keep in mind it's going in both directions. Okay, so we'll go ahead and set that up. And now it's blending from one to the next. Now it's blending from 100% to the particle age, which actually is at 200%. So we need to crank this one here up to, say, something like 600% to really see a difference. All right, now you can see where I've cranked up that 600%, I've got it going up way too far. I only want it to be down here around the ground plane. So we simply grab this one, drag it down. And a little bit too far, so drag it back up a little bit. And now you can see I've got that hotter spot there. Again, I can just click another one here and drag it up if I want to create just a little bit of band at the end. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's just stretch it up just a little bit more. All right, perfect. So now we've got our smoke plumes falling down, dropping out of the sky. We've got some luminosity set there. The next thing we want to do is tweak with the opacity a little bit. If we drive this down, it's actually going to help us to boost up the luminosity or the brightness a little by seeing further into the columns. Now we're getting some really nice burning effect here as they're dropping down. That's a little bit too severe. 40% is pretty good. Let's just go straight even 50. That's pretty nice. And let's see about decreasing our density. These columns are a little bit thick. So if I drag on the slider here, I can start to thin out the effect. You see how it's getting really thin down here especially. That's a little bit too much. Let's go back up to about 50. There we go. Now we can see it. Starting to break up the texture a little bit and giving us a little bit more variation. Let me show you again. If we drag this really far down, you can really see, especially down in here, how it really pulls the density out of the particles. If we push that back up, it gives us just enough back in. All right, and then again we can start to see the particles spraying out down here as well. All right, I like what the density reduction is doing to the bottom of the particles there. So I'd like to intensify that just for that area. I don't want to thin out the entire plume, just the bottom. So as we did with luminosity, I can apply another texture on the density and fade that at the bottom. Rather than using a gradient, I'm going to use a procedural texture of value and then use a texture fall off. This is a little bit tricky, but it's to show you another way that you can use procedurals with fall-off values to create gradient ramps, in case you want to use things like procedural ripples or fractal patterns with a fall-off as well. Rather than having to use the fractal procedural and an alpha on the gradient, you can do it all inside of one procedural with the fall-off. All right, so we're going to go back over to our density control here, and we'll choose the texture. And we'll go ahead and say we want this to be a procedural texture. And in this case, we want it to be one called value. And value will just give us a solid value. In this case, we're going to make that 10%. Now you can see by doing that, you'll notice that the entire area here just got reduced to 10% in density. All right, to really reduce the density of our clouds or our pillars. What we need to do is we're going to set a fall off over here based on linear y. Okay? Now, right now it's based on the surface position. We don't want that. We want the center of that fall off to be based on the world 0, 0, 0, which is basically the ground plane. So to do that, all I need to do is turn on world coordinates. Right now we're in surface-based coordinates or object coordinate space, so 0, 0, 0 is up by the actual particles, or where the particles are emitted. If we set it to world coordinates, that snaps down to the 0 plane of the world. So here we go, world coordinates. And now I'm going to set a fall off. Let's try like 20% fall off. And now you can see that it's blended that in, so we just get that effect down here. Let's set that up a little higher, maybe 40%. And there we go. So that's just tapering it off right at the bottom there, creating a nice tapered effect. So it's another way to do gradients using the procedural value. Of course, we can also use any of these procedural textures here, but in this case we wanted a solid value with a small taper on the end. So it's a good little trick there. Okay, so now we've done some creative work with luminosity, opacity, and density. Let's take a look at some of the advanced surface settings to finish this bad boy up. All right, we're going to go over here and use texture, and we'll just jump into our advanced tab. And you'll notice that we have selected the dedicated light, so that's good. What I want to do now is I want to tint this a little bit towards orange by setting up the ambient color down here. It's just going to give us a little bit of extra boost on that color there. So we'll go ahead here and say let's just choose kind of a lighter orange like this, a little bit more red. There we go. And you can see it's just going to give a little bit of tint. You can see it especially in here and some of the darker areas there. We also, let's take a look. I think we could probably turn off volumetric shadows. Yeah, that's going to be fine actually. We don't really need those for this because we're not that close to it, and we've still got enough texture in from the just general shading there. That's going to work pretty nicely. Let's go ahead and go over to our hypertexture tab, and I'm going to go ahead and change the crumple into turbulence. Gives a little bit chunkier effect there on the surface. And I'm going to change a few settings here. I want to increase the contrast. Let me go ahead and jump into a single particle preview here so you can see. Let's go to a slightly later frame here. You can see how it's actually changing over time. It's kind of cool to see it going through. Let's just go right in here. And I'm going to change the contrast a little bit. And that's just going to give us a little fuller effect on each particle. And let's just adjust the scale as well. Let's just crank this up a little. That's going to give us a little bit more detail in each particle, which will result in a better overall effect. Okay, so that's our little particle there. Let's take a look at it back here. Looks pretty good. In fact, you can even make a preview of this if you want, so you can see it over time changing very quickly. You'll notice the very, very hot particle as it starts off, and now you can start to see the yellow colors creeping in as we change from one portion of the gradient swatch to the next. So, alright, enough of that. You can see it's nice to see how it actually sort of erodes in. It just doesn't change from one to the next. It goes through the texture of the particle. Alright, let's go ahead and increase the amplitude of the texture a little bit. See if we can get a little bit more detail in there. That's looking good. That looks really good. Now we're almost getting sort of a fiery effect in there. Okay, let's go back to our scene preview. And we can see there we've got some nice streaming particles coming down. And I think we're ready to make a test render. Alright, let's take a look at the preview here. And what we can see immediately is that our fall off is a little bit too sharp. By the time the particles hit the ground, they're almost completely dissolved. You see a couple little cute particles spraying off here in the background. So we need to fix that. The way we can fix that is on that density parameter. Let's go back over here to our shading tab. And remember, we use the density procedural texture called value with a fall off based on the linear y. The problem we have is that the fall off on that linear y, so if you can imagine at 0, 0, 0 we have 100% and then it falls off very quickly. What we're going to do is we're going to lower the center of that, lower the texture position, and that should help boost up the density here. So let's go to position on this tab, and we'll set the y to -1. That brings it down. That should fill it in a little bit. There we go. Now we're really starting to see the particles on the ground. That's going to look much better. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at this rendered out and see how our final animation looks. Alright, there you have it. Looks pretty cool. We got our meteors tumbling to the ground. You see them spraying out little bits as they hit the ground and scatter. It's a pretty cool little effect there. If you want to try some variants on this, you can of course try adding your volumetric shadows back on there. See if you get a little bit thicker look to those plumes. Might take a little bit longer to render, but it might add a little bit of extra detail. Alright, that's it. Let's move on to the next project. Alright, this next project's pretty involved. We're going to have a couple different particle emitters. We're going to have some really nice HyperVoxels work, not only surface HyperVoxels, but also volume HyperVoxels. And we're going to create a giant explosion, but a very detailed explosion. So let's take a look at how we get started. Alright, the first thing we want to do is just load up our setup scene once again. So we'll go to load scene here, go into your setup directory, and you'll see one called explosion setup. Load that guy in there. And we're back into our little HyperVoxels room. Let's go ahead and set this to texture shaded solid. Alright, there we are. Now the first thing we want to do is we need to add a couple of particle emitters. So we've got right now one null object in place, and that's going to be our HyperVoxels giant sort of explosion in the middle. We're going to have two HyperVoxels particle emitters. They're going to create the initial explosion and the debris that's attached to that explosion. So we'll go back here to our Items tab, go to Add, Particle Effects, Particle Emitter, and we'll just type in this one as debris, and there it is. We'll add one more, and this one's going to be called Debris Trails. That's going to be the trails from behind the debris. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing we'll work on is the debris itself, and what we want is for this to be the actual explosion that comes out from the initial burst. So we'll go here to our Motion tab, and let's just go ahead and add some explosion here. We'll put this to 25, and now if we hit play, you'll see, boom, we actually have some explosion. You'll notice there's a light envelope in there. We've already got a light added into the scene for you that will coincide with the explosion itself. Alright, so this is sort of a strange looking explosion. We can see that the particles just continue to come ad infinitum. So let's go ahead and set this back in the front wireframe here. You can see we need this to burst and then the explosion to slow down. So what we want to do, or at least the number of particles to slow down. Let's go back to our generator here. And we'll say we want to generate by second. That's fine. What we want to do is have them start off and not coming out at all. In other words, we want to start with the particles not emitting very many particles at all, but then all of a sudden explode out and then stop back down again. So what I'm going to do is create an envelope this time on the birth rate of the particles. All right, so we'll go back here and we click on E for envelope. Now it brings us into our envelope editor. I'm just going to set this value. I'm right dragging to select it, and I'm going to set the value down to 0. Okay? I'll hit A to auto fit so we get back in there. We can zoom out a little bit here if we want to. Now I'm going to choose my add keyframe item here, and I'm just going to add a keyframe. It's at 7. I'm going to change that to 2, and I'm going to set the value to something really high. Let's just go 10,000. Okay, so we can fit that in there. You can see it goes from 0 to 10,000 particles per second over those first 2 frames. So let's see what we have now if we push play. Pow! Giant explosion. Pretty cool. Okay, so that's going to be the initial basis. A few things we want to change on that. Let's go ahead and reduce the scale of the emitter. You can see right now it's a little bit large, so we're going to scale that down. Let's go to about 1/10 its initial size, like that. So that's 0.1 by 0.1 by 0.1. And let's see how that looks. That's pretty good. I'm going to scale it down even a little bit more. Let's go 0.01. So it's very small, just in the middle of our world there. There we go. It's all coming from that one single point. Okay, great. And we'll set a particle limit of about 400 particles. That was a lot of particles there. That's our initial debris burst. That's going to be pretty cool. All right, that looks good. Now we're going to change a few things here. Let's go ahead and go to our particle tab. And let's go ahead and change the size. I'm going to tell it to show size. And we're going to put the particle size here at 0.01. And then we're going to let that plus or minus be 0.05. So we've got, if you notice, you can see the particles now. Some particles are very large, some particles are very small. The plus or minus value that you find after any of the other values in the particle effect window allows you to randomly modulate the initial value. So in this case, we had it set to 0.01 with a modulation of 0.05, which means it can be anywhere from 0.06 down to 0. Okay, so it's going to ramp it up and down that way. Okay, so now we've got some nice looking particle debris flying around. Let's go ahead and change the lifetime of the particles. Let's let them live for the entire 100 frames of the animation. And let's push play here. All right, so you can see this works pretty nicely because they explode out and then the inertial forces eventually slow them down. That's going to be a nice looking explosion, all those bits of debris flying all over the place. All right, the next thing to do is to work on the debris trails. So we'll select the second emitter, that's this one here, and we want these to be attached to each of these emitters. So what we know from earlier projects is that we'll parent that item to the other. So we go to schematic view. Here's our debris item. Or debris trails, rather. We'll hold down the control key, click on debris, and now it's parented. You can see that anywhere I move it, it moves along with it. Go back to our camera view, and now we'll go into the particle effects control panel, and we'll change this to the debris trails. Go to the generator tab, and as you're probably guessing, we're going to change this nozzle to parent emitter. And there we go. And now you can see if we push play, that some of these particles are actually now attached to the other particles. Now you notice it left some of the particles behind. This is just a little particle rendering error. This happens sometimes if you're changing values when your keyframe slider is not at 0. Generally you can rectify this just by going to your scene tab and hitting FX start, and it'll do a full simulation to get those back in order. So now you can see the particles are attached to each one. Now you notice right now the first thing that I can see is that for one thing we don't have enough particles. So we're going to go ahead and crank the particle birth rate up. Let's say that's going to be 150. And the next thing I can see is that we need to turn up the particle limit. So we're going to set that up to 8,000. Okay, so now we've got a lot more particles. I can also see, however, it's not leaving these as trails. They're really taking on too much of the initial motion from the parent item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my particle etc. tab here, and I'm going to dial down the parent motion a little bit. Let's just use our frame slider here. Drag that down some. Let's see how that looks. There we go. Now we're getting a nice bursting effect. You can see it coming up behind there fairly nicely. All right, let's dial that down a little bit more. Okay, that's pretty cool. It gives a nice burst. The debris flies out, and those guys continue. All right, let's go ahead and change the particle life on these also so they last a little bit longer. Let's set them to somewhere around 70 plus or minus 20 frames. So it could go anywhere as far as 90 or could stop as soon as 50. All right, let's go ahead and turn that up to, say, 30 so we get the full 100 frames on some of those particles. So you can see how they start to fade out, giving us a nice explosion effect there on the second group. Now to spread these out a little bit, we can add a little bit of explosion. So we'll put in a 0.1, just a tiny bit. And you see now that spreads them out just a little bit. And a little bit of vibration will help as well to start to spread those particles out. There we go. Now we're getting a nice explosion effect coming out from the middle there. You can also set in a minimum amount of vibration to sort of modulate just how much those particles can vibrate from their actual position. All right, another thing I like to do is add a little bit of gravity to these particles. So we'll go to the etc. tab here, and on Y, you'll see we'll just set a -1. See how that looks? And that just gives a little bit of downward pull. So it looks like these guys here, the initial debris that flies out, they've got more weight, so they keep on their initial path. And then the second group is more just like sparks and lighter bits that come flying out from there as well. So that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of resistance here, a little bit more resistance. Let's just crank this up. This judges how much the particles are actually affected by the atmosphere. So we can crank that up, say 2 or 3. Let's try 4 there. And if we do that, we may want to, let's add a little plus or minus or some randomization on that as well. And that's a little bit too strong, so we'll just turn that down just a little bit. As you can see, the resistance that we've added, that 4 value on resistance, is really prohibiting the particles from moving through the atmosphere. One way we can rectify that is, of course, to reduce that amount, but I actually like the resistance effect that it gives me by randomizing which points can travel which distances. So what I want to do is add a little bit more weight. This way each particle, based on its initial velocity, can fly further through the atmosphere. So let's go ahead and dial up the particle weight here. Again, we can drag the mini slider, and now you can see the particles actually will carry on through a little bit, and they're being affected a little bit more by the gravity. So just keep tweaking with these numbers a little bit. Let's reduce our resistance slightly, bring the weight back down a little bit. Again, we can do a little bit of plus or minus on that. And again, you can see we're getting a little bit of some particle area in there in the middle. Once again, if you just come back to your FX start here and run a full simulation, that'll get all your particles back into the actual sim there. And now we've got a nice initial burst. We've got the debris flying. We've got the sparks going. That is a nice particle simulation. So let's go ahead and move on and deal with some of the HyperVoxels settings now. The first thing we're going to focus on is the debris chunks. So each one of these little bits here, we want them to look like flying rock. What we're going to do is we're actually going to use HyperVoxels surface mode on these chunks on the outside. And we're going to use a hyper texture on the surface spheres. So instead of looking like little spheres launching out, we're going to use a severe hypertexture to erode away chunks of it to make it look like craggled rock. And then we're also going to use some different gradient effects to make the rock look like it's very hot or molten on the inside. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at how we'd set that up. Again, we're going to work with the debris here. So we open up HyperVoxels, and once more with Viper. Always with the Viper. All right, so we'll go ahead and double-click on debris, and you can see immediately it starts to render out all of our HyperVoxels in surface mode. All right, that's not exactly what we want, so I'm going to dial down the particle size here. So I'll bring these down much smaller. Let's just go down to, say, let's try about 120. That's a little too big. That's pretty good. Looks like 0.125. So let's dial that in directly. There we go. All right, so now we've got these particles flying around. What I want to do is I'm going to switch to a particle preview so I can look at just what each one of these sort of rocks is going to appear like when I get the texture all applied to it. All right, so here we have just one independent rock. Before I do that, I want to take a look at the size variation actually. So we're going to jump back into the scene preview, and you can see all of our little rocks in space here. I'm going to add a size variation of about 150%. So some of them are getting really large and some of them are getting really small. So now you can see we have a really nice separation from larger to smaller. It's a little bit difficult to see on that black background, so once again, we're going to disable the HyperVoxels, make a quick test render, come back over here, and take a look at it. So now you can see a little more clearly these some very large, some very small chunks inside of that area. Okay, so that gives us a nice bit of randomization there. The next thing we're going to do is start working on the hypertexture itself. So I'm going to go to a particle preview, and there it is. And we'll go over to hypertexture here, and I'm going to turn on, let's go with FBM, see how that looks. All right, so you can see immediately that's a pretty big chunky rock. All right, what I want to do is I want to erode some holes into it, so we're going to keep working with this hypertexture to dig out some areas of that rock. All right, the first thing we're going to do is add some more frequencies here. So I'm going to crank these way up. The frequencies is basically how much detail you're going to get into the texture. You can see now we've got some really nice model detail in there. The next step is to crank up the texture amplitude. So I'm just going to drive that way up. You can see how it's really starting to eat into the rock. In fact, let's just double that even. Let's go like 320%. Now we get some really nice looking chunked up rock going on there. Another thing I can do is change the scale of the effect. And you can see here, now we get a nice looking big chunk of rock going on with our hypertexture. It's a nice way to work with surface-based hypervoxels to get a pretty decent looking piece of rock. I can also increase the contrast here. The contrast is going to make the areas that go from the bumped out texture to the bumped in texture a little bit more evident. Let's try playing with the texture scale a little bit here again. I'm going to go the opposite direction. Let's see what happens if we scale this down some. Let's set this to about ½ meter. As you can see now, we really start to get some erosion going on. Let's take that even further. Okay, so you can see how we're really starting to get some nice erosion in that rock texture. All right, let's go ahead and dial the texture amplitude down just a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. The next thing I want to do, which is going to really bring this out, is to start working on a color texture based on the bump. So we'll go to the shading here, and we'll go to color, and we're going to apply a texture. What we're going to do is we're going to apply a gradient map to the object itself based on the bump, and it's actually going to read the hypertexture itself. So we can make in the inner area of the rock very bright, and on the outer areas a little bit darker, so it looks like it's glowing from the inside. All right, so this is going to work with the color texture here. We're also going to be applying a gradient on the luminosity in a little bit. So we'll go ahead and go to color, gradient, based on bump. And we're going to say it's going to go from 0 to 1. And let's just go ahead and start here at the beginning. It's going to be kind of a brownish color. Again, just work with our color swatch there. And it's going to go from there, it's going to go to sort of an orangish color. It's pretty good. You can see already our rock is starting to get a little bit more detail there. Then we're going to switch to a light brown or reddish color. So come in here and we'll tilt it towards a little bit red. Like that's pretty good. And then our last keyframe, we're going to go with more of a whitish. We're just going to darken it down a little bit towards brown. Okay. So here we can see, now you can see a little bit more detail on the rock here, but we still can't see much on the inside. That's where the luminosity channel is going to come in. So we go over to our luminosity tab here, and we click on texture. And now we go in and choose gradient once again. You can see immediately, just with 100% luminosity, how much more detail we're able to see there. So come back over here, and now we're going to ramp that. So let's say, all right, that's going to be based on bump from 0 to 1. And we're going to change that to go, let's say at the beginning, it's going to be about 15%. That's on the outside, so where it's bumped out. See here. Then we're going to go down and create a keyframe. Let's create a keyframe sort of in the middle. And let's say we want it to be at about 35% there. And then let's create a keyframe at the end here. And we'll set that to like 200%. Alright, so the rock looks a little strange right now because we've got the bump going so far in that it's pushing us completely to that white hot area. Not to worry, we're going to make a few tweaks here and it's going to look pretty sweet. So let's go ahead and jump back in. Let's go ahead and leave this like it is. It's looking pretty good. You can see a lot of detail here, but let's switch back over to our hypertexture and let's change the bump down a little bit and see how that works. You can see that's starting to bring it back in. Let's crank that back up to say 400%. You see that pushes it back out. But now, let's try turbulence. See how that looks. And so now you see you get this really nice glowing rock effect. Let's bring our texture back down a little bit. And you see you get this really cool glowing piece of space rock that's just exploded off of an exploding planet. So that's pretty cool. Let's take a look at how that looks in our overall scene. And now you can see these little bits of rock flying all over the place inside of our scene here. So that's going to make for a nice looking explosion when it starts off here at the middle. They're a little bit too bright, so I'm going to change one more thing. I'm going to go to the diffuse channel here, and I'm going to change diffusion a little bit. So let's go ahead and go back to our particle preview. And once again, we'll open up our procedurals, and once more with the gradients. You may see a running theme here with the gradients. We're going to use the bump map. And again, I'm just going to create one at 0 and one at 100. And the first one here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this one at 100. But then I'm going to turn this one down to like 15%. All right, so that means as we get out toward the outer edges, it's going to sort of darken them in a little bit. And we'll create another keyframe sort of right in the middle here. And let's just drive that down. Let's just put that at about 35%. So it darkens it up a little bit. And now you can see we get a little bit darker rock on the outside, and then it really gets hotter towards the inside. All right, and again, if we switch back to our scene preview, you can see all the little rocks there. If you want, you can make a preview, but I think you get the idea. We've got our rocks flying by, and you can see little pieces of space rock everywhere. All right, the next step is to fill in the debris trails behind the rocks. Again, we're going to use HyperVoxels, and we'll do a process similar to what we did with the meteor shower. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So we'll go over here to our debris trails, and of course we just need to double-click to activate it. Now right now you'll notice that I'm getting a preview render of both the trails and the debris. That's because I've got my preview options set to scene preview. It'll render every single item in the scene together. So it gives you a good way to see the entire process there. Let's go ahead and change this just to object preview. That'll show us just the particles in the preview, or debris trails rather. Again, you can see these are currently set up as surface-based hypervoxels. We're going to want to change that. Before we change it though, let's work on some of these settings. For example, let's bring the scale down. These are a little bit too big right now. That's a little bit better. Let's go to a later frame here and take a look. Alright, so you can see I'm getting some nice debris trail there. Again, we're at about 131 millimeters. Let's just crank that up to about 150. And again, I like to round that off, so we'll just type it in directly. And there we go. Looks pretty good. So now we'll just go ahead and change that over to volume mode. And what I know about the volume mode is that on this particular type of effect, I don't need to use any volumetric shadows. So the first thing I can do is go to Shading, Advanced, and turn those puppies off. That's going to save me a lot of test render time. The next thing I'm going to do is I have some dedicated lights here that I use. You'll notice I actually have two dedicated lights in this scene. So we'll select both of them, and those are going to be used to illuminate our HyperVoxels explosion there. Okay, let's go to a little earlier frame, do a quick test render. Looking pretty good. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and go back to our basic shading tab here, and now we'll go ahead and work on our color gradient. So go into Texture, once again gradient here. Gradient's going to be based on particle age. And we'll leave it white at the beginning, And then we're going to go towards, we'll actually tilt it a little bit towards kind of pinkish at the very beginning, just to give a little bit of coloration. And then we're going to add another keyframe, and this is going to go again towards the beige. I'm going to use the same basic color scheme we've been using for all these explosions. We start off kind of white, then we lean towards beige here. Then we'll go a little bit darker. Let's go down to, and we want the entire process here to be 100 frames. So that's going to help us to scale this out a little bit. Let's take this down to about 30. And this one's going to be more of a orangish brown. Once again, we'll bring in a little bit more yellow there. Pretty good. Then we'll go straight out brown. Like this. And then down here we'll end up more of a charcoal. Once again, bringing this down to 0, then right-clicking. We'll bring it up a little bit. We don't want to be completely black, but just kind of a dark, dark charcoal. And again, I can tweak with these values here to change the effect on the screen. All right, so that sets particle age. That looks pretty good. Got a nice basis for our initial explosion. We'll go ahead and tell it to use the texture there. Let's take a look at the hypertexture. I'm not in love with this crumple here. Let's change this to turbulence, see what kind of result we get. Again, it gives us a little bit better separation there on the particles. I like that quite a bit better, actually. I'm going to leave the frequencies at 3. Let's go ahead and turn up our contrast a little bit here. And let's crank up the texture amplitude. There we go. That gives us a little bit more detail in here. Okay, it looks pretty good. Another thing I'm going to want to do is add some turbulence. And again, as we mentioned before, when we add turbulence to the texture there, it's just going to constantly animate it. It gives it sort of a roiling effect. We didn't do that on the meteor shower because the meteors are basically just leaving the particles in the atmosphere and then it's just sort of dissipating. In this case, we've got things moving a little bit more rapidly, and let's add a little bit of extra detail. Also, since these particles, some of them are flying right by us, we want to be able to see that extra movement, sort of help sell the shot. All right, and we'll just, again, as I mentioned before, I usually like to turn this down a little bit just to slow down the overall speed of the turbulence effect. All right, so we'll go back to our shading now that we've got our hypertexture set up. And the next thing I'm going to work with on the shading here is some luminosity. So we'll go to luminosity, texture, and once again, with the gradient, based on particle age. I feel like I'm repeating myself because I am. All right, at frame 0, we're going to go with a value of 200%. Some really bright particles, as you can see here. Then we're going to drop down to, say, 100%. And then eventually, we're going to get it all the way down to, oh, let's go like to 40% down here at 100. So I'll put this guy down here, and we'll crank that down a little bit. And you can see it then getting a little bit cooler as you get towards the center. All right, so there we go. Starting off hot, cooling down a little bit. Let's bring this one down a little bit further. So starting hot, then cooling down all the way down through to the 100 frames. All right. Now let's go ahead and crank our density down a little bit here. Make that not quite as thick on the particles. Looks pretty good. And then the next thing to work with is the thickness and the smoothness. Again, bringing the thickness down a little bit. It's going to allow us to darken that up just a little, and we'll also get a little bit more texture detail. And then bring the smoothness up. Actually speed up our renders slightly. There we go. That looks pretty good. All right, now there's another thing I want to work with on advanced here. We've been using beer. Take a look here if we change this to self. You see we get a little bit more detail, especially in the brighter areas here, because now it's self-illuminated. Instead of taking all the illumination from the dedicated lights and shading there, it actually does some self-illumination, which sort of spreads out the lighting a little bit better, which is what you'd expect from something that's burning that way. It's going to sort of light the areas around it. All right, this looks pretty good, but let's make a few more tweaks to the hypertexture to see if we can improve the look of the explosion a little bit. All right, so we'll go back over to the hypertexture here. And if we go ahead and take a look at just a simple particle, we can see got a pretty nice looking particle here. So each one of the little particles is being replaced with that. So it's a pretty nice burning effect. But I'm going to change the texture a little bit. Let's crank that up a little bit. That's going to erode it some. It's going to make it a little bit thinner on each particle. Since we've got so many particles in there, that'll help. And let's turn our texture size up. Let's just dial this up a little. And let's just go ahead and crank it up to 2 by 2 by 2. There we go. Now we're getting a nice random variation on that. So when we go back to the scene, it'll be a little bit hard to see in actually object view from this distance. But once we do the final render, you see that gives you a little bit more of a fiery effect as opposed to the smoky effect we had a minute ago. So that's pretty good. The next thing we need to add in is the actual meat of the explosion. That's going to be the big ball of fire from the inside. So we've got our debris, we've got our debris trails, and now we need this giant expanding mass of flame. And for that, of course, we're going to use one single null and HyperVoxels volume. So here we go. All right, so we'll go back to HyperVoxels here, and we'll double-click on the HVA. You can see that gives us a small little circle here, our HyperVoxels surface. Let's go ahead and drag the scale up until we get it to about 4 meters, so we can see that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an envelope for the particle size. And we're going to create the envelope so that it starts off small, expands out to this scale, continues to expand, then shrinks down. One nice thing we can do, let me close the Viper window here. We can go over and do a show particles mode, and you can see now the particle effector here around that. Okay, so you can actually watch that scale up and down as it goes. So let's go ahead and go into our envelope here, and you can see here we have it. There's our keyframe, and I'm going to create a keyframe here about frame 4. At that value of 4. And you can see I missed frame 4. We can just select it by right dragging. And then I'll type in 4 here. And we'll leave the value at 4. I'll right mouse select the first keyframe here and set that down to 0. So it's going to start off at 0. It's going to expand up to 4 meters in scale very rapidly over those first 4 frames. Then we're going to go to like about frame 14. And it's just going to scale up a little bit more, not quite as much. All right, so let's go ahead and change. In fact, let's change this one to more like 3.5. And then at frame 14 here, just change that. So we get 10 frames in between those two. We'll make this about 5.5. So you can see it's just a nice arc in scale here. Now I'm going to create another keyframe at about frame 28. And this one's going to be at the same value. Okay, so we'll go ahead and type in 5.5. So we've got the same value. The reason I've done that is that means it's going to go up, it's going to scale up in size, and then it's going to shrink down just a little bit. And then we'll create another keyframe way out here at frame 60, where we'll set that one at more like 7.5. So it's going to start very small, expand up, contract a little bit, and then continue to expand slowly as if it were smoke. So what we've got is the initial explosion, which is all the energy, boom, exploding out. That's all the flame. Then it sort of dissipates, and then the smoke comes in and just kind of floats out from that side. So it's going to hit, reduce, and then go out into smoke. All right, let's go ahead and accept that. And you can see if we push play here, we can see our bounding area hits, expands, and then comes back. So that looks pretty good. All right, so that's not too bad. Now what we want to do, let's open up Viper again. And again, we're still on surface mode. That's not going to do at all. We don't want a big exploding basketball. We want a nice billowing ball of fire. So we'll go over here to volume mode, and we turn that on. Now you can see immediately that this is now starting to get into the slow render time area. Let's go ahead and scale it down a little bit. That'll help with the render times. But there are a number of things we can also do to improve on that. Let's shrink it down. We know this is going to be fire. So we don't need any shadows. So we're going to go to shading here, advanced. Let's turn our render quality down to very low for our tests. Set that to very low. In fact, we don't even need to turn shadow quality to low. We'll just turn shadows off. There we go. That looks pretty good. And we know we want to use our dedicated light 1 and dedicated light 2. All right, so that's going to brighten it up a little bit. Now let's work with the texture a little bit here. So we'll go over to hypertexture. And in this one, again, we're going to use turbulence. You see that gives us a much nicer looking sort of explosion style of turbulence there, or of texture. And 3 frequencies is probably enough in this case. I'm going to crank up the texture amplitude again just to rough it up a little bit, add a little bit more detail. That looks pretty good. And once again, we're going to add some turbulence to that. with slightly reduced speed. So we can do a quick preview here, just a quick preview render. You see expanding out. Looks like a big cotton ball right now, but you can see the scale expanding, and you can also see the turbulence moving through the texture very slowly. So it gives it a nice, continually changing. You notice like this area here especially, you can see this shape expanding out as the texture continues to change through the turbulence displacement. All right, so let's go ahead and display that. There, that's actually pretty cool. So you can start to see the effect of the explosion already. All right, you have to use your imagination and fill in the brightness and colors, but you get the idea for the moment. Okay, so that's pretty good for our hypertexture settings. I might want to dial the speed down a little bit. That texture was moving a little bit quickly. That'll slow it down just ever so slightly. Now we're going to go back to our shading, and this is where we start to get kind of crazy with all the settings again. So here we go. Let's go ahead and jump over to our basic settings here. And the first thing we want to do, once again, is work with the color. So we're going to go in to color texture, and I'm going to set a color gradient. Bet you didn't see that coming. And we're going to go in here to local density. Again, local density is going to change the color based on the thickness or the intensity of the hypertexture at that position. So we can make it brighter or darker based on how thick the local density of the texture is. This is a great way to create texture changes for things like explosions and fire. All right, so again, we'll start off somewhat whitish at the very beginning. I usually just bring this out of the completely white zone a little bit, just for good measure. And then we're going to create a keyframe here. Let's see. Of course, we want this on the local density. It's going to go from 0 to 100%, so that's good. When we get down here to about maybe 5 or 6%, let's just go ahead and dial that down a little bit. We want it to start turning more of that beige color we've been using. So once again, we'll go with our brown here. Just kind of dial in that beige. And you can start to see a little bit of texture change going on here. Then we're going to create another keyframe down here at more like 20 or 25. And this one's going to be pretty much straight out orange. We're going to darken that up a little bit. Okay, now you're starting to see some fire show up in here, right? Then we're going to go down to frame, or about 40% through the local density. And we'll make that more of a charcoal. Like this. See that filling in. And then we'll go in here right around 50 or 60% and really darken that up. A little bit more. All right, so now you're starting to get the effect of the explosion in here. It's starting to look pretty good. So we'll go ahead and say use that texture. That looks pretty decent. One thing I want to do, though, is I want the actual explosion to go from this hot, fiery effect to a smoky effect. So I want the color to change over time from this value into more of a black smoke effect. Okay, so how do I do that? If I just set the color here, well, I can layer another gradient on top of that based on the time, but it'll have to go from a transparent gradient, so it's revealing this bright surface, to a dark, opaque surface later on. So rather than just using color changes, we're actually going to use opacity of one envelope, or one gradient rather, layered on top of the second. So we'll come back over here, and we're going to go back into this texture, and we're going to say add gradient. And you'll notice that I've added a gradient. It's gone right on top here. And this time it's going to be based on particle age, or actually time rather. So it's the general time of the scene. And we're going to go ahead and set this to go from 0 to 100. All right. And the last keyframe is going to be very charcoal, very dark. Like this. All right. So now you can see if we go to frame 100 and we render that, you can see it's completely black. All right. So that's exactly what we want. At the end of the animation, we want it to be this nice black, smoky cloud. The problem is, if we go back to the beginning of the animation in here, our gradient is obscuring the color from the second gradient. So all we do is we go to this keyframe here and we set its alpha to 0. That means that the gradient there at this time is now transparent and will fade up over time. All right. Now this is a little bit too gradual of a gradient. We want to add another keyframe in here at about 25% or 25 frames rather. So let's dial in 25 there. And let's make sure that it's at 0% there as well. So that we know for sure from 0 to 25 frames, that second layer of dark alpha or dark color won't affect this layer at all. It'll start to come in over that 25 frames, or excuse me, the 75 frames from 25 to 100, and eventually be completely black on top there. So another way to use those gradients. Just remember, if you need to stack one gradient onto another and reveal one from the other, you have to use some alpha channel to change the opacity of that gradient strip. Good little trick there to use. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and use that texture there. And the next thing I want to do is work with the luminosity. Now the luminosity, I actually want to have the same gradient that I have right here. So I'm going to copy that gradient. We'll say copy. And we'll come back over to luminosity here. I'll say texture. And I go into that and I'll just say paste. Okay? And that has changed my luminosity to go from, you see, 100% here, the beginning, and then once we get longer and longer in the frame or in the scene, it's going to become darker and darker and darker until there's no luminosity at all. So you can see here we have the value at 100% at time 0, then we go up to about 70%, and then we're finally down to about 11%. So almost completely out of luminosity at that range. In fact, we should probably just dial that down a little bit. Now, we want to add another gradient based on local density underneath this one. So once again, we need to set the alpha channel here to 0. Set this alpha to 0. And that'll make, over time, it'll fade out that luminosity. All right? So we'll go ahead and add another gradient here. And this one needs to go underneath that one. So we drag and drop it. And there it is. And we'll just set this guy here to local density. And it's going to start off, we're going to get it really hot, 500%. Okay, now you can see that made this really, really hot. So what we need to do is create another keyframe down here, add a value of about, say, 80%. 80% through it, and we'll set that down to 0. Okay, so now you can see as it goes through the local density, right now it's very, very hot. As we go on in time, it'll continue to cool off. And the local density is giving us that nice bit of texture. So now we have this really nice looking fireball here that continually goes towards black. Pretty cool so far. Okay, so let's go ahead and accept that. That looks pretty good on the luminosity. And once again, we're going to do the same thing here on opacity. Get a little bit more variation. So we're going to go to opacity here. And again, we're going to start off with adding the gradient layer that we copied from the first one. And we need to make sure that it goes from 0% on the alpha channel, so it's not impacting it. And then ramping in. And once again, we need to add a gradient. Drag and drop that. And this one's going to be based on local density. And what we're going to do is we're going to set 0% value here of the local density to a 20% opacity setting. And then we get down further into it, we're going to set 100% down here, 100% local density, to about 200% there. And now we've got, you can see the flame really starting to come in there. Let's just go ahead, go a little bit further. And you can see how that's added a little bit more detail to the overall effect. All right, now you can really see this ball of fire reaching out at us. All right. The next thing we want to do is we're going to decrease the density a little bit too thick. So I'm just going to drive that down. You can see as I'm decreasing the density here, as it's just eroding the overall effect through the texture. So it gives you a real visual way to see exactly what's going on there with the density. And of course, if I bring the thickness back up, we're going to start to get a little bit thicker looking flame there. We can fill in some of these empty areas in the middle. And we're going to take our softness and drive that up a little bit as well. That'll help us out with some of these edges in here and also right around that area. Now you may notice that the HyperVoxel right now looks like a big white glob. We've got it to the point we had some nice texture in there, but now we've driven the brightness so much that it's really sort of overblown. Well, as we all know from watching Understanding HyperVoxels, and we all watched Understanding HyperVoxels, didn't we? We know that we can make radical changes in the lighting by changing the illumination model. So let's take a look at the lighting that we have set up in the scene and then take a look at the different illumination models. Alright, we're going to go ahead and hit the Tab key here to scale this out. And we're going to go into our perspective view. And again, we're using two lights. We're using dedicated 1, which is this distant light here that's pointing directly at our explosion. And then we're using dedicated 2, which is this point light right inside the middle of the explosion. Alright? Now, what do we know about using lights from behind HyperVoxels? How do you want to illuminate something if you're lighting it from the inside? Well, as we learned in Understanding HyperVoxels, we use the Rally lighting illumination model because that favors forward scattering light rays. So let's take a look here. We'll go back in, tab this through, go to Advanced, Illumination, Rally, and now you see our detail really comes back in there and we get a nice effect. I can also see that my hypertexture needs a little bit of tweaking. So we'll come back over here. Let's bring up the number of frequencies. That's going to rough it up a little bit. That gives a little bit more detail in there. And let's bring up our small power a little bit. Again, that's going to add some fine detail in these areas here. Just a little bit more. There we go. That's pretty good. All right, now I think we've got something. We've got a really nice sort of full-looking explosion. Now let's take a look at a preview render. And there you can see, nice-looking explosion. Hard-hitting, then we get the nice boiling effect. First initial energy explodes out, then it dissipates into black smoke. Pretty cool. I might like to change some things about the speed at which it turns into smoke. Again, that would be just as easy as going in and adding an extra keyframe and dragging that up. Let's go ahead and let's do that real quick. Let's go in here to our Shading tab, go back to Basic, and over here under Color, remember we've got this time-based curve here. We can just add this or drag this keyframe up a little bit, and that means it's going to go to black a little earlier. Or we can leave this down, create another keyframe, and drag that up. So that's just going to make it go to smoky black a little sooner. Let's go ahead and go a little earlier here, like around 84. And we can see now, starting to get darker a little earlier in the scene. And again, we can drag this up a little higher. And you'll notice now it's getting even darker yet still. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. Let's hit Use Texture. Let's go ahead and do a quick scene preview of the entire thing here. We'll go back to an earlier frame, choose Scene Preview, and now you can see the giant explosion in the middle that we just created, the big chunks that we created earlier, the nice streams coming out of there, out of that initial burst there. Looking pretty cool. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at the final render? Alright, so there you can see it. Looks pretty cool. Got our planet blowing up, big chunks of debris flying everywhere. We got the debris trails hanging out from behind there and the gravity pulling those down. Then, of course, that giant ball of flame in the middle that turns into smoke. So, pretty cool effect all in all. Now you know the secret to blowing stuff up. Alright, there you have it. 3 cool projects using HyperVoxels and particle effects. We've done meteor showers and rocket exhaust, and we've even blown some stuff up. So I hope that you've learned a lot and you can take this knowledge and apply it in your day-to-day work. We hope to see lots of cool HyperVoxels experiments from those of you out in the Lightwave world. Thanks a lot. Until next time, I'm Brad Peebler, and keep on rendering.